Boa noite, Vila Santiago Guerra. Obrigado aqui por ceder o seu tempo precioso aqui para ser tradutor. Boa noite ao Tamás Gerőcs, né, que está aqui com a gente. Hoje a gente vai trabalhar sobre a perspectiva de uma análise a partir da extrema-direita na Hungria e vendo essas considerações, como isso se aproxima da realidade brasileira ou como entender essa extrema-direita como um fenômeno mundial. A Hungria tem uma particularidade, mesmo no período do nazismo, em que essas vertentes de ultradireita chegavam a um ponto de ser até mais radicais na Hungria, né? Então, é interessante a gente pensar que isso é uma memória recente, não tem 6 décadas, né? E aí, ao mesmo tempo, a gente percebe que antes o fantasma que rondava a Europa era o comunismo, e hoje o fantasma ou o pesadelo que ronda o mundo é o neofascismo, é o neonazismo. Então, para a gente hoje, essa live é importante para a gente pesquisar aí algumas pistas. Então, boa noite, Viles, boa noite, Tamás Gerőcs.
It's up to you now.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and I understand I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework of my study that focuses on the most recent political phenomena in Hungary from a political economy point of view. So I'd like to stress this, that the kind of analysis I give in a way is a specific approach to this question that's been raised, and this is a question for me of political economy, particularly international political economy.
Ok, so ele vai falar a partir da pesquisa dele, né? E a pesquisa dele é em economia política, portanto ele faz a análise do ponto de vista das relações internacionais, mas também com base na economia, né?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Tamás.
Yeah, so of course the question is, if I understood correctly, to put it in plain English, like how did the kind of far right come about? How did they appear on the political stage, and what's the kind of behind story of the visibly rising spectacularity, at least, but also politics of the far right in the case of Hungary? And maybe it makes sense to start off with by saying or asking the question, what exactly we mean by the far right? Are we talking about specific politicians, political movements, groups, or processes? And I argue that what might be interesting from the point of view of political economy in understanding these recent phenomena is a process that involves all the actors, not only in the political landscape, but also we'll see the larger population and the kind of type of social composition, social system that's been emerging or reconfiguring in Hungary. So this is a process, and before I continue, I'll let some time for translations. I want to conclude here now that we are going to look into actually large processes, historically long durée processes, as well as internationally embedded processes, not only local processes, but localized processes.
Muito bem. Então, ele está dizendo que, claro, a questão pode ser focada sobre vários pontos de vista, pode ser abordada levando em conta os atores, quem são, né, aqueles envolvidos, os políticos, mas o enfoque dele vai ser, como dito, no processo, né, no processo histórico, e que aí não é restrito apenas, né, a Hungria, e nem tampouco a personagens determinados, mas envolve a própria população, né, e também uma análise de longa duração, né, e internacional. Não será restrito, não é possível, pelo menos não é assim que ele propõe, que se fale de uma perspectiva assim, apenas vendo por que de repente há pouco tempo esta ascensão espetacular da extrema direita aconteceu lá. Então, vai procurar dar um enfoque, digamos assim, mais largo à questão. Okay, Tamás.
Yes, so I will just make some very brief snapshots of these historical processes, going a little bit back into history. But before doing that, obviously, I still want to define what I mean by this far right in Hungary, because I really am not going to talk about specific personals here or party agendas. In one way or another, there's been always around. But I'm going to talk about a regime consolidation in Hungary, the peculiarity of which is that there is a fascistization process across the board. It actually even includes a parliamentary party on the left with regards to their rhetoric, their approaches to certain questions, or even some of their leaders. So this is a regime process, and we'll need to understand how this regime emerged. It obviously emerged from the collapse, dismantling of a previous regime. And what does this regime, first and foremost, socially comprises of, in terms of a new political bloc with new elites, as well as their linkages through coercive and consensual means to the larger population, what kind of a social characteristics they have. And then I would like to elaborate it, as I've said, in a historical context, as well as looking into a little bit of the kind of policies they do to achieve the kind of power block formation and the kind of a social situation in which this system can rule. And again, before doing that, and let me just conclude here, and I know I've spoken quite a bit, I'm just reiterating that this is a process. It's not a monolithic regime. It didn't jump from the Mars, but it's a product of an ongoing process, and it's very dynamically changing. So it's a fascistization. The way it operated even a few years ago was in different conditions than the way it's operating now. So it's constantly changing, unfortunately, for the worse in terms of the fascistization.
Muito bem. Então, ele insiste em dizer que vai examinar um processo, não vai falar de pessoas, ele vai tratar de um regime que se instalou em decorrência do colapso do regime anterior e como esse processo é um processo de fascistização e que abrange vastas camadas da população e também do espectro político, inclusive mais à esquerda. E como, portanto, não foi assim algo que caiu do céu, de Marte, esse regime lá, quer dizer, ele foi implantado e vem se desenvolvendo dentro de um processo que é muito dinâmico e que está sempre, portanto, rapidamente se transformando e se transformando para o pior.
Okay, so maybe continuing with the background history, obviously what you need to know about Hungary is it's a very small, semi-peripheral country that, to some degree, a lot of the historical legacies, social structures, in a surprising way, comparable to Brazil. Of course, in a lot other way, it's not. So the way it integrated into the world economy, the most recent episode of which started around the 1970s crisis, still under state socialism, produced what we call like a tension, a classical tension amongst the capitalist ruling classes. And because Hungary is very small and very deeply integrated into the capitalist system, it's a long history that sort of accelerated by the end of state socialism in the early 1990s, the composition of this elite tension is very much between, very schematically speaking, international capitalist classes, a kind of a comprador capital, that occupied a lot of the economy across the board in the early 1990s, vis-a-vis a local property class. We might call a kind of a national bourgeoisie, for the lack of a better word. This situation crystallized already at the end of the state socialist period due to various economic mechanisms of neoliberal policies, IMF policies, trade relations, austerity. I don't think I have much time and space here to go into details, but if anyone interested in the Q&A, we can go into historical details. So it's crystallized. It started to crystallize during that period, but it really crystallized in the neoliberal 1990s. So there emerged a type of a system, let's call it a neoliberal regime, that was in which the domination of foreign capital was uncontested. Of course, the key process here at the time was privatization, fire sale privatization, and the kind of a shock therapy that a lot of the Eastern European countries in particular experienced after their sort of socialist transition, post-socialist transition to a capitalist economic system. A lot of these elements are, again, comparable to the Latin American experience and history in a bit of a different historical context, but again, through privatization and IMF austerity measures. And what occurred to be by the 1990s is a very fragile situation in which really foreign capital owned almost all the kind of assets, like valuable assets in the economy, and they really dictated the kind of a labor regime, the kind of a labor supply they need. Again, I might come back to this question of the labor question. I'm sure it's very important, and we want to understand the social background of the regime, not only from the point of view of intercapitalist struggles, but also it's a kind of a dialectics with a kind of a labor resistance or organizing labor or actually dismantling labor institutions. So anyway, let me stop here. So we are in the 1990s in this neoliberal regime.
Bem, então ele está dizendo que, claro, tem algo que remonta à crise ainda do período socialista, dos anos 70. Assim, antes ele falou que, portanto, há estruturas sociais lá na Hungria estabelecidas que guardam similaridade com estruturas que existem aqui, ou mesmo na América Latina em geral, e embora lá seja uma sociedade pequena, né, e bastante homogênea em relação a nós, sobretudo, né, mas o que ele diz é que a partir dos anos 90, então, com a queda, né, do regime socialista, e entra muito fortemente a onda neoliberal, né, e se estabelece uma dominação do capital estrangeiro, né, inclusive ditando regras para o mercado de trabalho e uma ampla privatização e adoção de medidas do FMI. Portanto, um quadro que, de fato, guarda, né, semelhança com aquele que nós já conhecemos, né, aqui também. E, enfim, é nesse contexto que vai agora começar o processo que leva ao regime de extrema-direita que está instalado lá já há um bom tempo, 10 anos, né? Ok, Tom.
Vini, seria bom ele falar menos, né? Falas longas para tradução.
Mas, enfim, é sempre um sumário que eu vou fazer, né? Não dá para pegar tudo que ele fala. A tradução é consecutiva, não é simultânea, né?
Claro, tranquilo.
Thomas, he was asking if it would not be better if you could do shorter blocks.
You want me to do shorter blocks?
Yeah, that's what he's asking too. Yeah. We can.
You can actually stop me when I.
No. I'm following you when I make. Of course, I can translate everything you said exactly like you said. But I recall. I give it back as a summary.
Okay, I'll try to shorten my blocks. So, of course, this system, neoliberal regime that emerged in the 1990s, was very, very fragile. It was very dependent on external forces, external capital, external economic and political integrations in the Euro-Atlantic context, particularly the European Union and the NATO. The elites at the time they did not question the necessity of this form of integration, as well as the peculiarity of this, if we want to compare, for example, with the Latin American experience. And I hope it makes sense to do that here, is that the neoliberal regime was tied to, quote unquote, a democratization process in the case of Eastern Europe. So it was initially not a kind of a top-down authoritarian system, despite the dependencies and fragility of it, but it was at the same time, if you like, it was a coincidence, but obviously it was not a coincidence. It was tied to the democratization process of state socialism.
Okay, let's do it short now. Então ele está dizendo que esse processo de 90, que começa em 90, né, mostra uma fragilidade, né, do Estado, que, portanto, estava muito dependente de forças externas, do capital externo, mas também da União Europeia, da OTAN, né? Enfim, era um país que estava saindo de um regime, passando por um processo que foi destrutivo e estava se reconstruindo, e ele diz que talvez isso possa ser algo que difere em relação a processos na América Latina, que eles também naquele momento estavam se redemocratizando, né? Estavam entrando no processo de adoção de instituições da democracia liberal, no caso, né?
Yes, so obviously, if I can just emphasize it, but I hope it's obvious that it was in a crisis mode. So this transition produced immense social and economic crisis in the country through the shock therapy I've briefly mentioned, and a lot of social and political tensions, which by the end of the regime, let me run a little ahead, would lead actually to the collapse of this hegemonic bloc. So before going further to the collapse, what we need to understand here is, first and foremost, the elite on the political level was still carrying the legacy of state socialism. So it was a socialist liberal alliance in particular that conducted neoliberal shock therapies. And the ideologies or the kind of political incorporation they initiated was through liberal and social democratic principles, which worked to some degree, but obviously we see a growing number of disenfranchised elements of this social system, largely working groups, working class citizens who lost their jobs because of all the industry or all the economy collapsed around them in the socialist transitions, as well as domestic capital, which at the time became not quickly disenfranchised from the socialist liberal elite, but they had a love and hate relationship, and let me put it in this way, and it was a slow alienation because they themselves lost out against international capital.
Então, também ele diz agora que, lembrando que essa transição se deu num momento de grave crise econômica, né, a transição do regime socialista para esse novo regime, e que a elite política ainda era constituída por aqueles que participaram do regime socialista. E eles fizeram uma aliança com os liberais, numa relação de amor e ódio, né, mas que foi esta aliança que conduziu o processo tanto de liberalização da política e da economia. Tá? E sim, com um verdadeiro colapso do regime que impactou, claro, as relações de trabalho, muito desemprego, enfim, uma crise econômica também, né? Estava sendo enfrentada. E a solução, então, era adotar as instituições social-democratas e liberais.
So, of course, we see during this period a conservative opposition party. They have their own interesting history. So you had one conservative party that came out of the regime change of the early 1990s, but it very quickly disintegrated and it disappeared from the political scene. This party doesn't exist anymore. So you had a vacuum situation on the right, on the political right, and it was very marginalized in this period. So what happened that there was a party called Fidesz. Today, I'll come back to them, which was initially a small junior liberal party, a junior partner of a larger liberal party. But because they were a junior partner, they themselves were marginalized even in the neoliberal situation. So at some point, when the neoliberal crisis deepened, this junior liberal party decided to shift its political position and occupy the vacuum that reappeared on the conservative side. This party was Fidesz, led by Orbán Viktor at the time, who's the recent prime minister of Hungary. And by this switch, he did not only occupy a new ideological position in the political landscape, but he started to reorganize or reconfigure a political movement that was mostly based on the interest of national capitalist groups, as well as a growing number of relatively skilled workforce. So he tried to mobilize those disenfranchised groups against the socialist liberal regimes. I must say that he really tried it relatively early on, and it didn't work for him for a very long time, almost for a decade, because the collapse of this regime did not materialize yet. It was a tension, but it was a slowly evolving tension. And much later, when this regime collapsed, maybe I'll talk about the end days of the regime, why it collapsed. Then the vacuum opened up so big that this new conservative political elite could realign itself mostly with the domestic capitalist groups, and it mobilized a large number of alienated, disenfranchised middle classes and working people as well.
Muito bem. Bom, então ele diz que havia ainda no início, né, desse processo partido conservador, que era oriundo ainda do regime anterior, mas que logo desapareceu, não permaneceu por muito tempo na cena e deixou um vácuo no espectro à direita, no espectro político à direita, mais à direita, conservador, né? E nesta época havia um partido liberal maior, e esse partido liberal maior tinha um partido auxiliar menor, aliado dele, que é o Fidesz, do Orbán Viktor, né? E foi em face desse vácuo que surgiu a direita, e esse partido se desligou daquele que ele apoiava, que era majoritário, do liberal, né, e passou a ocupar esse lugar à direita, e em aliança com os capitalistas locais, né, e também visando a classe média e trabalhadores menos qualificados também, que estavam, nesse momento, atravessando uma grande crise de desemprego e de insatisfação. That's it.
Okay, so a few words about the crisis of the neoliberal regime that led up to the collapse. It was, to some degree, it was due to the fact how it integrated into the larger world economy. It was, as I said, a very fragile dependency. By the 2000s, it was a fully liberalized economy, and despite the privatization process through which foreign capital flew into the country, it slowly lost much of the income it produced because the economy was dominated by international corporations. They freely moved in and out their revenues. They rather moved it out, repatriated it. So there was a deepening capitalist crisis, an indebtedness actually, and the only available political means that this regime had within the confines of being a member of the European Union in the early 2000s, as well as liberalized open economy, was austerity. So the deepening crisis pushed it to more and more austerity. In fact, it was even losing on the kind of democratic image that it gained through the democratization process of the post-socialist periods. So it entered into a very deep crisis mode in which it really delinked and alienated even the core constituencies that it had in the previous decades. And the last days of the regime was, of course, the world economic crisis, which was very much unmanageable in Hungary. So there was a IMF program, and even the last prime minister resigned. So it was a visible collapse of that regime. While at the same time, Fidesz, as a relatively new conservative party, mobilized more and more social segments. So it was actually not only simply a political mobilization, but it started to reconfigure a new power bloc, including or renegotiating the position of the national bourgeoisie, domestic capitalist classes, mobilizing a large part of middle classes and the working populations through mostly ideological means, but also with some social policies. And the aim was to reconfigure the capitalist class alliances with international capital. And again, the world economic crisis in 2008, 2009 opened up actually an opportunity to make this negotiation with international capital. So we see a new configuration of a capitalist regime led by a conservative political majority after 2010, which started to push all the situation from the kind of neoliberal to what they call an illiberal mode of capitalist accumulation.
Então, aí pelos anos 2000, a economia estava completamente liberalizada, né, completamente aberta e adotando os padrões liberais, e com isso as corporações, as empresas estrangeiras, internacionais, passam a ter uma presença maior e predominante, e com isso, claro, como o capital deles é sempre para fora, não é? Eles tiram do país, então o país empobreceu, estava muito empobrecido, entrou numa profunda crise, que terminou sendo agravada em 2009, e é nesse contexto que o Fidesz, então, se afirma, né, nas suas alianças com uma burguesia nacional e com também aquela parcela da população que estava desprotegida e em relação à qual ela, então, desenvolve alguma política social para contemplar e angariar com isso o apoio, né, e transitar para fora, como eles propunham, de um regime neoliberal para um regime iliberal.
Yeah, so maybe a few words about this reconfiguration, or what is new about this illiberal regime. Certain things are modified, or there are some novelties here, but of course it's a continuation of the process of broad economic integration as well. And maybe we can see a bit of some of its policies, is particularly industrial policies, in the next block. So of course, the major issue here is to reconfigure the capitalist class alliance between international capital and national capital, make new concessions to international capital, to particular international capitalist groups against others, and to gain some space for domestic capital to regain strength, or to stabilize its position within the economy at first, and then maybe on a larger regional international scale. But that's more like a perspective. So the major international capitalist group that was provided with very dear concessions is the German industrial capital, car industry in particular, which still can use the political majority of the Hungarian government for delivering its industrial needs that it cannot get in Germany anymore, but it very much needs this because of the global competition. So they relocated a lot of industry, and this illiberal regime is very much based on what we schematically might call a reindustrialization of the country, with the support, or with the rising role of German capital. That's on the one hand happening. You want to start? Okay.
Então, foi feita essa reconfiguração das relações entre o capital estrangeiro e o capital nacional, local, de modo a permitir uma maior presença desse capital nacional na economia, e também ele destaca uma aliança privilegiada que ocorreu com a Alemanha, sobretudo a indústria de carros, de automóveis, a planta, né? As plantas que já não estavam mais sendo utilizadas na própria Alemanha foram transportadas para a Hungria, instaladas lá, e com isso teve início o que o partido, né, Fidesz, propunha como sendo uma reindustrialização da Hungria.
Yes. So what? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes. Okay.
So what's happening there, and to put it into political economic perspective, is that with international capital in certain sectors of the economy, it's continuing neoliberal policies. In fact, it's harshening neoliberal policies with authoritarian means. These sectors can largely be labeled as export industries, dominated by German car production, but there are other sectors as well. The point is that any industry that's in the world economy that's producing exporting to the world markets, that's where international capital gets even subsidies for the Hungarian government, the tax credits, all kinds of things. There is a macro policy line to support exporting international capitalist classes. Let me just name these policies, and then probably I stop and turn to the domestic capitalist class. So the industrial policies are more visible, the most visible in, I would argue, in probably in three terrains, politically industrial terrains. One is taxation. Hungarian tax system is increasing, surprisingly neoliberal. Corporate tax rate is flat, 9% officially, but with subsidies, companies pay approximately 3-4% of their revenues. The largest car producer multinationals, they pretty much don't pay tax. The other terrain is labor reforms. They introduced the very, very authoritarian labor reform that actually stirred up really trade unions to demonstrate. It's called the slave law. We call it the slave law. So it's a very anti-labor stance. And third, it's really deeply reformed the educational system, and it really attacked institutions of social studies, humanities, especially critical social studies, and it's reformulating higher education to support industry, and it lowers the average rate of high school students. The mandatory schooling is being lowered in order to transfer actually middle-aged high school students into what they call a dual training system, again, supplying industry with cheap labor. So it's taxation, education, and labor reforms are the classic policies that it's using to subsidize and support export-oriented multinational companies in Hungary.
Muito bem, então ele destaca três políticas que foram as principais, né, para dar esse suporte ao capital estrangeiro, que se instalava no país para isso obter vantagens da exportação a partir de lá. E claro, diz que há outros ramos, mas ele mais uma vez enfatiza a indústria automobilística, né, alemã. E as políticas são políticas de subsídios, né, para essas empresas, para essas indústrias, né, redução de impostos, e uma reforma trabalhista, é o segundo ponto, que foi muito dura, muito autoritária, e retirando direitos, né, trabalhista, ao ponto de que eles chegaram a chamar, né, os sindicatos de um direito escravocrata, que foi implantado, slave law, né, direito escravocrata, direito de escravos. E o terceiro ponto foi a reforma do sistema educacional, uma reforma que atingiu tanto o ensino fundamental, né, o ensino na escola, que foi alterada para tornar esta preparação já na escola mais adequada às indústrias, e isso atingiu também a universidade, não é? Um verdadeiro ataque às humanidades, né? As disciplinas das humanidades, para assim favorecer aquelas que então seriam as áreas de formação voltadas para a indústria.
Yes, so let me talk a little bit about the role of the domestic capitalist classes. So as I've mentioned, the system is based on subsidizing multinationals in the export industry, but regaining strength and support for domestic capital in certain specific areas in the economy that are non-exporting kind of like non-tradables, the domestic service industries. In those particular cases, industrial policy is actually very hostile to international capital. There's been confiscations, actually very high taxation on certain industries. A lot of industrial policies, it's probably details are not so important here, but the point was that in domestic service industries, for example, in telecommunications, in retail, in energy sectors, in utilities, they kind of nationalized. They did not privatize, they nationalized assets, and they provided national capitalist groups to gain access to this. And one more thing, besides renationalization in the domestic services, the state, illiberal state, is attempting to use other international capital sources to diversify away from Western German capital, to have alternative capital import sources as well. And the major imports it uses to subsidize domestic capital is particularly Russian and Chinese capital. So it supports, through various geopolitical means, Russian and Chinese investments in certain areas where it can ally those projects with the local capitalist groups. For example, it builds a new nuclear power station with Russian capital. It builds new railways with Chinese capitals. A new Chinese university is about to be opened. But as I've mentioned, telecommunication companies, if not Western, like let's say German, but Chinese, they are actually welcome. So you see Chinese investment entering into those domestic service industries as well.
Muito bem, então ele explica que a política implantada foi de separar setores da economia para o capitalismo, os capitalistas locais, né? As classes capitalistas húngaras, e, portanto, evitando nesses setores a presença, por exemplo, dos alemães, né? E ele cita o setor de energia, das teles, né? E aí, nesses, por outro lado, eles procuraram aliança com russos e chineses. Né? Inclusive, por exemplo, na área de educação também. Então, ele vai estar para se implantar universidades chinesas lá. E também, por exemplo, na área da energia nuclear. Então, nesses setores, houve uma renacionalização, porque antes chegaram a ser, né, claro, foi tudo privatizado, mas aí passaram a renacionalizar essas áreas e protegê-las do acesso aos alemães, do bloco ocidental, digamos assim. Por outro lado, e levando a que as alianças fossem com esses outros dois países, Rússia e China.
Okay, maybe let me make my final block here, and then I know it was a lot of question or a lot of instances we might come back to for more details if the audience would like to. And in my last concluding block, two things needs to be mentioned. One is still going back to an interesting geopolitical questions that's combining the EU and Russia and China. So there's a geopolitical transition here happening that is very important for the survival of this regime. I've mentioned the role of China and Russia with alternative funding sources. But of course, what we need to highlight here is that the regime can mostly use EU funds, European Union transfers, the money that's been redistributed in the European Union, to subsidize and feed domestic capitalist classes. So you have a type of a division of labor in the EU in which these peripheral Eastern European countries, particularly Hungary, allows large European industrial capital, German car industry, to use this site for its global needs. It delivers everything it needs, but it wants to use the European money to feed its own little capital. So you see the reconfiguring element here. Shall I stop here, or shall I? Okay, let's stop here, and then I'll make a final block.
Ok. Então, a gente está chegando na conclusão, no último bloco, né? Para abrir as questões. E a primeira parte desse último bloco, ele destaca que tem esta configuração geopolítica, né, essa tensão entre China e Rússia e a União Europeia destaca a Alemanha, no caso, e que, nesse sentido, a Hungria não quer deixar de ter acesso aos fundos, né, da União Europeia, e por conta disso, então, ela continua favorecendo a presença de indústrias desse bloco, especialmente da Alemanha, né? Podem, portanto, lá instalar tranquilamente à vontade a sua planta automobilística para atuar internacionalmente, inclusive exportar a partir de lá, e ao mesmo tempo, que se obtém por este meio, financiamento para o capitalismo local, e estimula também essa aproximação do capitalismo local com o outro bloco, né, com o bloco da Rússia e China.
So let me conclude with the fact that I want to go back to this process of fascization, which is, I think, the subject of our discussion today. And I provided a bit of this political economy framework that's fueling this political shift or this political process. How? So this type of integration into the world economy, and with the subsequent kind of a social system upon which it arises, produces first and foremost deep social contradictions and social crises on various levels. Mostly, there's a lot of the costs put on working class families, but also on lower middle class families. So you see actually a polarizations even in the middle classes. Higher middle class accessing domestic capital is subsidized. Lower middle class and working class are used as resources for capital. So it's the social gap is widening visibly in this situation. The political articulation, the way it goes, turns the landscape more towards the right, because liberal left is carrying still a kind of a stigma or a very bad legacy because of their neoliberal past, and the parties that articulating social frustrations in a way that poses a real challenge even to this conservative bloc actually is coming from the right, even right to the conservative bloc. It's actually coming from the far right. So you see a dynamic that even under this very hegemonic system, relatively authoritarian system or illiberal system as it calls itself, you see a rising tension and political challenge from questioning its national agenda by using more radical nationalist rhetoric, which dynamic pushes both the regime, both the government, as well as its opposition into a very competitive sphere of far-right rhetoric. And this is, maybe we can discuss it in a little more detail. I know I put it in a very schematic, brief explanation, but I wanted to demonstrate that the tension that appears from this socio-economic situation that's being created by the government is articulated in a type of a extreme nationalist far-right politics that's triggering the shift towards the far right. It's affecting everyone, as I said. It's even affecting social left parties who are part of the landscape, and it's creating actually a surprisingly competitive situation of who is the legitimate holder of the kind of a nationalist agenda that's been set by the government, but that government is losing legitimacy, and more newly rising far-right groups are claiming legitimacy that they represent the nationalist interest.
Muito bem. Então ele está concluindo, né? Claro, tem muitos detalhes que podem ser ainda explorados, se houver interesse no debate, mas ele está concluindo, então, para mostrar, para dizer como esta estrutura, né? Infraestrutura econômica permite aparecer no plano político, não é? Esta é uma distância muito grande entre aquelas classes mais altas que são privilegiadas por essa política econômica de captação de subsídios para ela, que então se torna cada vez mais bem sucedida, e em contrapartida a classe média mais baixa e as classes mais baixas são completamente tratadas como mera recursos, né? Só fontes de recursos para o enriquecimento das classes mais elevadas. E nesse sentido, então, é que o nacionalismo começa a se disseminar, o desprestígio dos políticos mais liberais é muito grande por conta da decepção com o neoliberalismo, né, que aconteceu no início do século, né, do nosso atual século, de 2000 em diante, como foi dito. E então está acontecendo uma grande competição em torno de quem vai se posicionar como o mais defensor dos interesses nacionais. Portanto, uma tendência à direita, mesmo havendo o desprestígio, né, do atual governo, mas a perspectiva é que ele venha a ser substituído por aquele que melhor se apresente como o legítimo representante da política de extrema-direita que interessa a maioria, que seria, portanto, esta nacionalista, né? De defesa de interesses nacionais e, portanto, blocos internacionais quaisquer.
Okay, so maybe we should open it up for the Q&A session. And just before doing that, I would like to highlight the fact that super interesting changes are occurring, because you will have an election in Germany this Sunday that will have a huge impact on this regime, and you'll actually have an election in Hungary early next year, in next spring. We already are in a political campaign, so there are actually high expectations and forecasts where these dynamics we've seen evolving for 10 years now, since 2010, where it's going to go after next year.
Então, ele só termina ainda lembrando que as eleições domingo na Alemanha, né, deverão ter um impacto muito grande, e lá na Hungria, e que também a Hungria já está mobilizada para as eleições que ocorrerão no início do próximo ano, e, portanto, segundo ele, a expectativa é de que venham mudanças lá, em função disso.
Opa, excelente a exposição do Tamás, obrigado aí pela exposição. Fábio Sobral, boa noite, bom tê-lo aqui também. Queria fazer alguma pergunta antes da gente abrir lá para o chat?
Tá. Bem, boa noite ao professor Willis, prazer tê-lo aqui.
Totalmente.
Boa noite ao Tamás, a você, Urbano. Eu tenho uma pergunta. Então, pelo que eu entendi, a Hungria se equilibra entre um desejo nacionalista, mas uma dependência tecnológica e empresarial do capital?
Estrangeiro, né?
Isso, estrangeiro, exato. Alemão, principalmente, né? E chinês, né, como ele diz.
E por outro lado, exato. Então, the colleague, they are greeting you, and he's asking if he understood right. In Hungary, you have one side this desire, this nationalist desire, and the other side, the dependency from foreign sources. So how can we equate this?
Yes, I think the colleague understood it correctly. So when I referred back at the beginning of my talk to the kind of semi-peripheral integration, which compares to Brazilian experience and other Latin American experience across the board in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world, of course, it's a very dependent situation. So largely it depends on capital import, technological import, and it usually comes under some kind of domination of international capital. I know it's a very schematic way to put it, but that's a classical form of semi-peripheral dependency. What distinguishes it from a peripheral dependency is that you still have local capitalist groups. And if you go to very peripheral situations in post-colonial Africa, you don't even have local capital. You have only colonial capital. In semi-periphery, such as Brazil, you do have quite a big bourgeoisie and also domestic capital in various forms in oil industry, let's say, or in the domestic market. Brazil is a vast market. I'm sure it's important or in the media you have domestic capital. Hungary is much smaller, so and even the kind of geopolitical context of the country being, as I mentioned, EU and NATO member, it really restricts a lot of the policies, and of course the domestic market is not very big, so the kind of space for domestic capital to navigate is different from Brazil. It's much narrower, if you like, although there are interesting available means like EU transfers. So yes, it's both in this very dependent situation, if you like. You see the kind of struggling or the kind of reconfiguring national capital that's trying to renegotiate a position in the world economy with the help of the state. And in this historical conjuncture, it's this illiberal state that representing the needs of these negotiations. It's very, very limited because of these larger dependencies. In fact, it's creating new dependencies with Chinese and Russian capital. It cannot produce, it doesn't have enough capital. It has to use external resources. But what it can do is that I would call it like it diversifies its resources. It will not only depend on German investments and European funds, but it would use other sources to have a multiple alternative sources, which would create a space, like it would maneuver better in this dependent situation.
Ele diz que o Sobral entendeu correto, é isso mesmo, e então ele destaca, né, como já foi mencionado por ele rapidamente no início, que é nisso que ele vê a semelhança conosco, no Brasil, mesmo com a América Latina, a condição de dependência semi-periférica da Hungria, que não é periférica propriamente, como, por exemplo, países da África, que dependem completamente dos colonizadores, né, do capital externo. Eles lá têm, como nós aqui também temos, uma classe capitalista local, nacional, que detém acesso a recursos, embora tenha menos margem de manobra do que, por exemplo, aqui, que tem um mercado muito maior, e aí o que portanto, isso explica porque eles procuram, então, diversificar, pelo menos, a dependência, né? Não ficar dependendo tanto só do lado ocidental, especialmente da Alemanha, mas depender também, não é, do lado oriental, do leste, né? China, especialmente China, mas Rússia também. Mas, de qualquer modo, é um país que é da OTAN e é da União Europeia. Enfim, então, também essa manobra tem suas limitações. Não. Foi isso. Mas, enfim, sim.
Não, assim, eu queria só as pessoas presentes aqui, rapidamente, né? A Joana dando boa noite, estudos audiovisuais também dando boa noite, Felipe Neves, boa noite, Armando, Maurício, boa noite, camarada, Óbvio Pós-TV, também, grupo. Maurício, ele tem uma pergunta, né? Se existe alguma força consistente na perspectiva socialista marxista na Hungria hoje.
Now, here we have a question about the perspective of the socialist, Marxist socialist forces in Hungary today.
Well, that's an interesting question. The chances or the perspectives.
Yes, if it's somehow representative.
Yeah, well, I would say that we're living in very controversial times, and my answer would pinpoint to the controversy regarding socialist Marxist left in Hungary right now. So as of political representations on the larger political landscape, I would argue there's no left right now. It's the whole landscape shifted so much to the far that even parties that call themselves left are actually on the right. They're not pro people. However, and of course, the environmental is very hostile to Marxism right now. So we're really living under a kind of a far-right rhetoric, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ. So it's a very, very harsh rhetoric that is official. Like that's what you hear in the TV every day. That's this hegemonic rhetoric. It's not a far-right group saying it. It's the official state is promoting it. So the environment is very hostile. But on the other hand, because of its own crisis and a lot of the contradictions it produces extensively, and by time, I would actually argue that it's losing legitimacy. It's itself turning into a crisis mode that is similar to the late neoliberal regime. There is actually space amongst the popular forces, amongst populations, that opens towards different narratives and different interpretations. And there is actually amongst intellectuals on the one hand, but also a lot of social activism that is using Marxist, let's call it Marxist analysis, not only in intellectual discussions, but with their praxis, whether it's their own solidarity economies, commons, shared like cooperative movements, all kinds of localized activities that seem to be able to provide viable alternatives to the crisis of the hegemonic system, and that attracts people's attentions because they're not just intellectual, but because they really provide a kind of a survival tactic. So to put this long story short, yeah, they're under the crisis of extremely nationalist hegemony. There is space opening up for intellectual work and activism that is informed by social Marxism. And in Hungary, the deeper this crisis evolves, actually, the more space we have, and you see more groups on the board doing that.
Sim. Bom, ele diz que, na perspectiva assim da cena política, da grande política, não há. não tem esquerda. Mesmo quem se diz de esquerda, a prática não é de esquerda, não tem nenhuma política propriamente em favor do povo, são xenófobos, são anti-LGBTQI+, são, enfim, né, os atores políticos principais, lá nessa cena não aparece, né, posições marxistas ou né, sequer uma força política que se possa dizer realmente de esquerda. Agora, o que ele vê, primeiro, ele vê uma perspectiva de que isso mude, porque esse regime atual, esse regime está em crise, né? Então, o aprofundamento dessa crise vai abrir espaço até para que colapse e aí surja algo diferente. E naquilo que a gente pode chamar de micropolítica, sim, ali há a presença, não é? Por exemplo, no ativismo, os movimentos de solidariedade, os movimentos de cooperativas e movimentos, como ele disse, até de sobrevivência, né, daqueles que se solidarizam para sobreviverem à crise que estão passando ali, e claro, entre os intelectuais sempre, não é? Ali você tem presente uma análise de origem marxista, de descendência marxista, de afinidade marxista, que embasam na prática, mas que é nesse nível, né? Interessante, não é no nível da macropolítica, digamos, da grande política, é no nível da política e do cotidiano, né? O que, aliás, até lembra uma grande filósofa de lá, né? A Agnes Heller, né? Fala disso. Né? Que, aliás, é até bom saber, talvez, o que é feito dela, né? Está viva ainda lá, né?
Está em Nova York.
Não está por lá mais? Não tinha voltado?
Não, ela saiu bem antes. Assim.
Não, saiu, mas não tinha voltado? Não sei. Não conheço a biografia dela.
Ela morreu ano passado, não foi, não?
Foi.
Já morreu, pois é, não sabia nem se estava vivo. We were talking about Agnes Heller. If she's still in New York, she's still alive. Yes, she's still alive. She still lives, no?
No. She passed away, Agnes Heller.
She did?
Yeah, not long ago, actually. It was an accident. She was very old, but she drowned in the lake. She was going swimming.
In Hungary?
In Hungary.
She was there.
She lived in Hungary. Yeah.
Yeah, she came back. No? She came back from New York long before. No?
I mean, she was retired, I suppose. So she spent her retired years in with her family, I suppose, in Hungary. I don't really know the personal details, but it was last summer, if I'm not mistaken, that she had this accident.
Yeah. Então, ela de fato, depois da aposentadoria, tinha ido morar lá, né? Estava morando lá. Estava com bastante idade, mas estava bem, tanto que ela de fato faleceu no verão passado, afogada tomando banho de lago, num lago. Estava tomando banho numa lagoa, num lago, e se afogou, né? Estava morando lá, assim. E eu tenho... Sim, fala.
Tem aqui... Eu vou fazer uma lista, e aí eu acho que faz um pouco um bloco, né? O Maurício também disse como está o debate sobre o legado do Lukács, né, hoje na Hungria. O Emiliano dando boa noite. O Emiliano sugerindo que eu também escreva aí um artigo pequeno para o blog da TV Comuna. O Eros faz uma pergunta. Boa noite, camarada. Gostaria de saber algumas recomendações sobre a Revolução Húngara, de Bela Kun, que foi afogado no berço, né? O Ero dando abraços, o Emiliano brincando aqui um pouco, né? Tomara que não, Maurício. Se marxista foram aqueles que colocaram Lukács no tanque de guerra rumo a Moscou. Né? O Ero repete aqui a pergunta em inglês, já traduziu.
Tá.
Né? Deixa eu ver. E o Emiliano tem aqui, caro Tomás, não há mesmo uma força de esquerda democrática, anti-stalinista, anti-autoritária, que reivindique o movimento de 56?
So, people have some questions. One of it was written in English. One asked about Lukács, if there is inheritors of his legacy there, intellectual legacy, active still nowadays. The other one asked about Bela Kun, if his efforts, the failed revolution, he tried, if you could recommend something to could read about it. This one asked. There you have, even in English. And there's another one about asking if you could write a 2-page text, just 2 pages to publish in the blog. They have to. And what else? I think that was it for now.
Okay, maybe I quickly go through the questions. So with Lukács, of course, the situation around Lukács really represents what I've discussed about the Marxist tradition in contemporary Hungary. So in the hostile environment, actually, there's been some attacks on Lukács. His statue was removed, and his apartment was an archive for his his works were archived there, and that's been also removed, or there was an attempt to remove it. But there is a small circle in Hungary, part of this Marxist tradition. I may name them. It's worth to know their name. It's a journal in Hungarian. It's called Eszmélet, consciousness in English, and they are actually some of the senior Marxist people working in that journal. I know them very well as well. Krausz Tamás, for example, is the chief editor. So they mobilized to save the archive, and I think finally they achieved it. So it's under their supervision now, in my understanding. But there's been a lot of controversies about the Lukács archive because of the state attack on that. So there is a legacy. There are people carrying this legacy, but in a increasingly hostile environment. That's the short answer to this.
Yes. O Lukács, de fato, tem um pequeno grupo que procura manter o legado dele, especialmente esses que estão em torno do jornal Consciência, né, em português, Krausz Tamás, que é o editor-chefe, ele conhece bem, mas num ambiente muito hostil, né, a estátua do Lukács foi removida e tentaram também acabar com o arquivo dele, que foi felizmente defendido pelos seguidores, mas enfrentou muita dificuldade e, como eu disse, não há assim, uma força política significativa à esquerda no cenário político maior, né? Hannah Arendt, né? Aluna da Hannah Arendt, Agnes.
Yeah, so the second question about Bela Kun. And yeah, it's a very good question. I am not sure I can make an immediate recommendation on reading, so I'll have to think about it. But we certainly have readings on the first Hungarian Soviet, right? Which in a strange sense, it was a relatively unique phenomena in 1919. Around the time of the Soviet Revolution, you only had these little Soviet republics outside of the Soviet Union. There was a small attempt in Germany at the times, and the Hungarian republic was a peculiar case. It lasted for 144 days, as far as I remember. So it was a very short period, led by Béla Kun, who then later fled. They emigrated the country. So you have a lot of readings on this, the Hungarian Soviet Republic in 1919 March. Obviously, I'm not sure how much you have on the personality of Béla Kun. In Hungary, you have quite a bit, but unfortunately they are not in the Marxist tradition, but very mainstream historians with their own ideologies. They portrayed Kun. I would need to look it up if what is available in those languages that you asked me about his personal biography. I'm not aware of any literature at the moment, but if you email me, and I'll share my email address with the organizers so they can provide it to the audience, I will help you find some readings on that.
Yeah. Sim, então ele disse que de fato teve essa instalação efêmera de uma república soviética liderada pelo Béla Kun, não durou muito, né, como foi dito mesmo, mas é uma experiência importante, que tem bastante estudos lá na Hungria, não, infelizmente, como ele disse, não uma tradição marxista, mas uma tradição ortodoxa da história, e, portanto, é preciso tomar um certo cuidado, né? E ele se dispôs a responder por e-mail, vai fornecer o e-mail dele para a organização, passar para o Eros aí, para que eles possam estabelecer esse contato e ele fazer a recomendação das leituras. Ele próprio precisa pensar e ver o que tem nessas línguas, né? Não é húngaro, né? Claro, húngaro. Só os húngaros mesmo, e pouca gente fora eles consegue ler, né?
Okay, finally, the final questions I briefly respond to. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to contribute to the blog, but I have to emphasize that as I guess most of us are under a lot of workload and work pressure, so we'll have to negotiate a little bit like deadlines and things like that. I cannot promise anything now, but if, again, you reach out to me on emails and maybe suggestions of topics, titles, I'll make some times in my schedule to contribute.
E com relação ao texto, ele disse que, claro, sim, se dispõe, agora precisa negociar, né, como ele diz, a questão aí do cronograma, porque ele já está com muitos compromissos, muita pressão de trabalho no momento, mas com o tempo ele certamente vai fornecer, né, uma contribuição para o blog, basta chegar aí a um entendimento. Eu fiquei curioso também fazer uma pergunta a ele, que eu já adianto qual é, para depois fazer para ele em inglês, sobre o papel que tem ainda hoje uma instituição que foi muito forte lá na transição, não é? Depois do regime socialista para o novo regime, digamos assim, que foi aqui a Corte Constitucional húngara, né, que era uma corte muito aberta, e ela exerceu um papel de governo quase, ali naquela transição lá no final do século passado, né, digamos assim. E aí eu vou perguntar a ele se ela ainda é uma instituição importante. Pelo visto, não deve ser, porque não se opõe às políticas que são violadoras de direito, né? Mas, enfim, eu gostaria de fazer essa pergunta a ele. Tamás, now this is a question from me. I just told them what it's about. It is about your constitutional court. I think we still have one. And I recall attending to a conference in the 90s at the time of your transition, and I recall someone speaking very well, very good about your constitutional court, that it was very open, anyone could have access to it, ask for protection of its rights, of their rights. And of course, I guess this is lost by now. It's been probably a long time ago yet already. But what's the situation today of your constitutional court?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and it does exist as of an institution, but it's not, it's not functioning in this liberal notion of the check and balances system as it was initially designed in the period of post-socialist democratization, however, under the neoliberal regime. Now, in the illiberal regime, you have so many of these institutions are still around, but they hollowed out and they don't function as part of the checks and balances, but they actually usually function as a support system to the government and to the regime, and to quite a large extent it applies to the constitutional court as well. It's been filled up by members loyal to the governing parties, and you cannot really bring any cases that would seriously challenge them politically. Yeah.
That's it. Thank you. Ele disse que, de fato, essa é mais uma instituição que foi esvaziada, né, do seu sentido original, que está completamente ocupada por pessoas que o regime colocou lá e que são auxiliar do regime. Não exerce sequer o papel clássico, né, justamente de exercer o controle da separação de poderes, manter a separação de poderes, né, o equilíbrio dos poderes, né, e nem tampouco oferecer a proteção aos direitos dos cidadãos, como no passado ela fez. Né? Ou seja, o regime iliberal, como ele caracteriza o atual regime, é um regime que não tem a possibilidade de ser desafiado por um judiciário, especialmente um Supremo, né, como nós temos aqui ainda. Né?
Sobral, você queria fazer uma pergunta?
Gostaria, só que tem uma pergunta do Emiliano, essa aqui, Urbano, talvez seja melhor, porque ele fez há algum tempo. Ah, não, já foi feita, né? Ah, foi feita, desculpa.
Não tem.
A minha pergunta seria assim, eu vou fazer uma pequena comparação com o Brasil, certo? Nós temos uma economia dependente que precisou de uma ditadura para superexplorar as camadas trabalhadoras. Mas o resultado hoje é desindustrialização. Eu perguntaria se a Hungria está em algum ponto desse caminho.
The colleague is asking for a comparison to Brazil in the sense that we had a dictatorship. We had a dictatorship that was used to exploit even more the working class in the service of the capital. But now we have a desindustrialization process. We are desindustrializing. Is it happening something like that also in Hungary?
Yeah. This is a very, very good question, and if you look at the broad picture, where I like starting from, of course, there are a lot of similarities, but also very significant differences between Brazil, the Brazilian legacy, historical legacies, and Hungary, even in terms of the colonial legacy is obviously very different. Or the military is very different. In Hungary, the military never really played a key role. And in my understanding, even if you look at the recent Brazilian government, it has its traits, right, in the military, and you have a like almost like some of the personnel of the military dictatorship came back. That's that type of legacy we don't have. So going rather concretely to your question, The very interesting thing in Hungary was that you had both a deindustrialization process and a reindustrialization process, and the reindustrialization process was stronger, and at the end of the day, it really industrialized the country. The deindustrialization process was more comparable to Brazil. It occurred under the neoliberal shock therapy and demise, and it led to the collapse of the domestic industries that were established in the so-called import substitution industrialization. Again, that's comparable to the Brazilian period of the actually starting from the 1940s, but rather in the 1960s and 70s under the military dictatorship. Also, Hungary had the import substitution industrialization under state socialism. So the local industry was under the supervision of some form of a state, whether a military state or the state socialist state. So that one deindustrialized, that disappeared. That was a shock therapy. Very similarly to Brazil, the difference is that international capital uses this infrastructure, the remaining infrastructure, labor, geographic proximities to produce for the global economy. In my understanding, that happens in Brazil to a very small extent, and mostly for the domestic markets. You might have German car producers are active in many of the Latin American countries. I know Mexico a little better; they're active there too. But probably the German car makers in Brazil too. Yeah. I assume they don't. The Brazilian economy is not as dependent on them as the Hungarian economy is dependent on them. So they don't really reindustrialize the Brazilian economy, but they provide products to the domestic industry. Whereas in the case of Hungary, they really reindustrialize the whole economy for exporting, not really for the domestic market. That's insignificant for exporting. And that aspect is different. So the dominance, the share of German industry international industrial capital in the economy is much larger in Hungary than in Brazil. But it's also due to the fact of the size of the country, to its geographical proximity to German industry. I really don't want to go far into the detail. That's my research area, but in this industrial relocation, like industries globally reorganizing, right? And it actually, geography does matter a lot in this. It's very much regionally embedded. So a lot of the German industry actually goes to Eastern Europe, and it doesn't go anywhere else. It doesn't go to Central Asia. It goes to Brazil only to provide the local market to some extent, but it doesn't want to use Brazilian labor for global export industries, contrary to Eastern Europe. One of the reasons amongst many is even geographical proximity, very close infrastructure. It's very easy transportations, let's say between Czech Republic and Germany, in a few hours. It's almost, it doesn't matter. The border in the EU, it doesn't matter anymore. So logistic wise, it's still very regional, this process. So that's one reason why its impact on the Brazilian economy is not as strong as on Eastern European economy, and for that reason the reindustrialization does not occur to the same extent. So deindustrialization is a stronger process. In the case of Eastern Europe, Hungary, you had the same deindustrialization process, but the reindustrialization process is so dominating now that we almost forgot about the deindustrialization.
De fato diz que, claro, tem semelhanças, e diferenças entre nossos países. É claro, tem essa semelhança da substituição de importação, porém o país, por exemplo, lá não tem o papel dos militares que tem aqui, né? E lá, ao mesmo tempo que teve a desindustrialização, teve uma reindustrialização muito forte, e aproveitando, né, a infraestrutura que ainda estava presente lá e questões geográficas, a proximidade, né? Por exemplo, a Alemanha favorece muito. Então, se implante lá, se instale lá indústrias que são voltadas não para o mercado interno, como são as daqui, né? Mas para o mercado internacional, né? E os fatores como a proximidade e a logística que favorece que se faça isso lá, ao invés de, por exemplo, fazer aqui, né? E, nesse sentido, o processo deles de reindustrialização terminou superando, né, o problema da desindustrialização. Mas é assim, é voltado para fora, né? Não é algo para o país, propriamente. Né? E ele disse também que não prefere não entrar em detalhes, é o tema que ele está pesquisando no momento, e futuramente pode receber algum resultado dessa pesquisa dele.
Eu gostaria de abusar um pouco e fazer mais uma perguntinha. Então, a Hungria desempenha um papel central nessa, vamos dizer assim, nesse projeto eurasiático, na iniciativa Cinturão e Rota da China, e a Alemanha talvez já demonstre aí que tende para a União Eurasiática?
Nice. He apologized for asking one last question, but he's curious about what you think about the role of Hungary in this rearrangement involving China, Silk Route. If Hungary is taking a role on that, maybe doing it for Germany as proxy, somehow proxy state, doing what Germany cannot do it so open. So, what do you think about the role of your country on this rearrangement?
Well, actually, before briefly answering the question, we just published a blog article with a colleague of mine in English, and exactly on this question. So I'm happy to share it, and then you can go more into the details. I don't know where I should put it in the chat room here or the comment section. I'm not sure. I'll give me a second. I'll have to look it.
I think we have a text to it there.
Okay, I'll have the link. So let me just link it here.
Ele acabou de publicar artigo sobre isso. Daí, ele acabou de publicar artigo sobre isso com
Chinese
amigo dele.
Hungarian accumulation regime. So you can read it, the more details. So my short answer though is that well, obviously this is China's multilateral global investment project, so Hungary doesn't really play a role in it. It's a very, very, very minor player. So from the point of view of the project itself, however, if you come down to a lower regional scale or even the national scale, then we'll immediately see that this is a very prominent project that the government uses for as I said, subsidizing domestic capital. So a lot of infrastructural projects are actually funded by China, and these infrastructural projects differ from more regular Western-funded infrastructural projects. They have very different conditionalities. You have a lot of debates about that even in the literature or in the political literature, what those conditionalities are. Business-wise, they're not necessarily very good. So you might pay a lot of interest rates. China wants a lot of things from you, even outside of the business. But politically, for the local political elite, it's more flexible and more open how they want to use it, if you like, in their crony capitalist way of using it, which is much more difficult with EU funds, to be honest. So they like it. They use they use these funds to diversify themselves away from Western capital and to use it more broadly for their projects. So in a lot of these infrastructure projects, you have domestic capital, local companies engaging themselves. As I mentioned, the most peculiar case in China is a railway line. China is building actually transport infrastructures in Africa. It's building a lot. It's building quite some in Latin America, as far as I'm concerned. And it's also trying to access EU. So it's building, especially in Eastern Europe, it's building quite a lot of infrastructures, railways, bridges, roads, where local capital can enter. And a peculiarity about Hungary is that, and we have a lot of debate nowadays because of the political campaign, that China is setting up its first largest overseas university, the Fudan University. The article is actually discussing that. And that's going to be in Hungary, in Budapest. And the interesting thing is, if you remember what I said about the education reforms, how higher education has been reorganized in the service of industry and how critical thinkers have been ousted or disciplined. One case, if you ever heard of the Central European University, was moved from Budapest to Vienna. And instead, you have now Chinese university being invited as a new sort of a support system. If I don't want to exhaust or really sort translator, but it's an ideological geopolitical switch as well. CEU was founded by George Soros. It was a very liberal institution, so they really ideologically attacked liberal intellectuals and their university. They ousted it, and instead they invited a friendly Chinese university to almost like to replace the CEU, Central European University. So that's again a very peculiar alliance, if you like, international capitalist alliance between leading Chinese investors and local Hungarian domestic capitalist groups.
Ele está dizendo, como mostra o artigo dele, por exemplo, que ele parte da análise dessa instalação na Hungria da maior universidade chinesa fora da China, né? Essa universidade de Fuda, que vai se beneficiar daquela reforma universitária que ele mencionou, que foi feita para afastar o pensamento crítico, né, ou disciplinar, quer dizer, quem não concorda, quem não aceitasse era demitido, quem se submetesse podia até ficar, e para favorecer assim um ensino voltado para a indústria, para as indústrias. E a China, então, que já vem fornecendo infraestrutura, né, não só lá, mas na Europa do Leste toda, na própria África, né, construindo muitas ferrovias, né, é uma forma de ela acessar a União Europeia por aí, né, a China. Então, isso de fato mostra que está havendo esse arranjo, né, geopolítico e, claro, o papel da Hungria não é tão grande, mas ela exerce sim um papel nisso daí. E, de qualquer forma, o impacto no próprio país é grande, não é? Porque os políticos se valem dessa relação com a China para se afastar da dependência muito grande das forças ocidentais, né? Pois é isso aí. Esse comentário aí.
O João dizendo, a Hungria é uma colônia alemã, uma reserva da força de trabalho para a linha de montagem de produtos industriais de consumo alemão ou de consumo europeu, sob o comando do capital alemão.
O que ele disse é a segunda opção, né? O que está em parênteses, né? Foi o que ele disse na exposição, né? Você acha que você vai perguntar? Acho que já está meio...
Não, eu acho tranquilo. Vili, só perguntar o seguinte, das conquistas do processo de revolução, o que existe ainda como legado? Certo? A primeira coisa. E a segunda, como se deu o desmonte daquilo que não sobreviveu aí no processo? Porque educação, ele já mostrou que sim, né? Desmontou.
É.
Mas como é que foi a reforma trabalhista, por exemplo, acordo dos sindicatos?
Aí, você quer detalhes sobre isso? Acho que é melhor esperar o artigo dele para o blog, né? Não? Traduzir cansa pra caralho. Né? Eu acho, né? Não sei. Posso perguntar sobre o legado, né? Porque ele já disse que não tem, mas a gente pode confirmar com ele. Né?
Ele falou durante a exposição que foi tudo privatizado, né?
Sim, mas, por exemplo, na Rússia, a privatização se deu com as frações da KGB, né? Na Hungria, foi privatizado direto ou teve um desmonte interno?
São detalhes, não? O que você acha, Urbano? Acho que está meio tarde. Né?
Não, tranquilo, então tranquilo.
Cansado já, né? Semana dura, né? Bicho. 15:10, sexta-feira, cara.
Relaxa, então. Tá bom. Então, vamos agradecer. Então.
Quer dar uma aprofundada aí. Acho que nem ele está já com muita disposição, né? Vamos ter pena do nosso convidado e do seu tradutor.
Tá joia. Então.
So he was trying to deepen in some questions, and I just told him it's late at night. We have a hard day work, and I think this deepening could be made, if you wish, in this article. You promised, you said you could write, and now we have this article you already wrote. That is also
maybe we can pick a final question. I'm okay with that. Let's say we can pick a final question. If you had a lot of questions, just choose one you think is the most interesting or fitting to the discussion.
Yeah, the legacy. He was asking about the legacy. If there is really no legacy of the socialist times, of the socialist revolution, there is nothing left of that.
Which the 1919 revolution?
The old one. The revolution from the old times.
But which old times? Of course, that's the question. Because we had the state socialism in Hungary, but that was a very different period from the 1919 revolution. So in Hungary, there was, state socialism was not created by popular forces, but actually it was undeniably created by Soviet occupations after the Second World War. The revolution that occurred in Hungary was in 1956, which was an anti-Soviet revolution to some degree, but we have a lot of discussions about it. So the recent hegemonic regime, very conservative regime, wants to portray it as it was a national uprising against communism, whereas in reality, actually, it was a workers' squatting factories, and they demanded workers' rights, and they demanded real socialist management and cooperative property relations against the Soviet-imposed dictatorship. So there is actually a legacy of 1956 in the left as well, because it was really initiated by workers. They established workers' councils. They run the factories. So there was actually a very much an interesting socialist alternative to the type of state socialism you had under, a Stalinist rule.
O que ele diz é que, a revolução socialista dele foi feita pelo exército soviético, né? Foi ele que implantou lá, o mando militar, o regime na Hungria. E o que se pode, considerar que foi uma revolução que houve lá foi a Revolução de 56, ou o Levante de 56, contra a União Soviética, né? E reivindicando o socialismo, né? Contra o socialismo de estatal da União Soviética. Né? Quer dizer, isso sim, claro, isso ainda é algo que permanece na memória e que tem, nesse sentido, um legado que ainda é reivindicado, né? Mas por conta de ser um socialismo antiestatal, um socialismo feito para as classes trabalhadoras e não contra elas, né? E por elas, mas não houve uma revolução feita por elas para implantar o regime, né, soviético. Isso foi implantado pelo Exército Vermelho, pelas forças que venceram a Segunda Guerra Mundial e ocuparam esse pedaço do planeta como seu despojo de guerra, né? É isso, é o que o Emiliano disse, né? Quer dizer, no comentário dele, ele confirmou.
Vili, então vamos agradecer, encerrar aqui. Eu queria
Thank you very much.
Agradecer o Sobral, que está aqui com a gente, o Tamás, que sempre vai estar de braços abertos aqui na TV Comuna, também como na revista Pasquinagem, como também no blog. Agradecer ao Vili pela exposição da tradução aí. Muito, muito boa noite. Muito obrigado, Vili.
O Urbano convida para que outra vez a gente conhecendo os artigos dele, também possa debater outros temas aqui.
Sim, tranquilo.
Para deixar aberto o convite à porta.
Pronto.
So they are thank you very much for your kindness, for your time, and we're going to read your material, and eventually, if you could come back sometime to discuss it again after the reading, after the studying of the material, we would be very grateful.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a great pleasure to start this discussion with you, and I appreciate it. You initiated it, and I'm very open. So, my email address. You can always reach out to me with questions, comments, sharing materials, and I'll be happy to continue this conversation.
Sim, ele diz que fica agradecido e feliz de continuar a conversa. Você tem o e-mail dele e é um prazer, ele está aberto para dar continuidade, sim, claro.
Vili, muito obrigado aí pela sua disposição, tudo. Sobral, aquela musicazinha aí da TV Comuna, eu estou aqui noutra plataforma, não consigo entrar. Você coloca aí para encerrar? Então, boa noite.
Eu não sei fazer isso não, mano.
Então vamos encerrar aqui mesmo.
And saying good night. Thank you very much again.
Tchau,
Good
tchau.
night. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.
See you.